In this video, we're going to take a few minutes to look at AR and VR and talk about the basics, so that way you're set up well to kind of look at some more things and do some more reading on what some of the details. So, jumping into this, first we're going to talk about this idea of extended reality. And this represents all the possible mixtures of virtual things, so virtual elements, and real elements. And by virtual and real, we just mean things that, are generated by a computer versus things that already exist in the physical real world, something you can touch or interact with. And this includes AR and VR, but we don't want to think about it necessarily as a split, but more as a spectrum. So at one end, you'd have all virtual. At the other end, you'll have all real. And then you can kind of talk about being somewhere along the spectrum. Now, it's a spectrum kind of qualitatively, not necessarily quantitatively. Like, there aren't necessarily fixed stops on here, like this is virtual reality, this is augmented reality, this is something else. It's just that something might be, in this extended reality or this mixed reality, and we'd say it's more virtual than another context. Or another one is more real. And that's just how much of the real world is there versus how much of the virtual world is there. So let's talk about kind of the two main things that we'll be looking at. So the first is virtual reality, and this is a world that only exists virtually or on the computer. So nothing in it is real, like physically real. Metaphysically, like theoretically is an idea, it's real, but it doesn't exist in the real world. So technically one can argue, although it's not usually how it's referred to, but like all current video games technically are virtual reality because they have a world or a reality that's entirely virtual. None of that is physically existing. But usually what we're referring to is when you're using something like a headset or something that you are, feeling like you are physically in that virtual world. And this is because if you're using a headset, it sends a different image to each eye, and that in turn produces the illusion of depth. So if you've got your two eyeballs here, and you're looking at something, what you're going to see in your eyes is going to be a slightly different picture. You can test this by, if you have I'm just going to sketch these lines in here. So what your eyes will see will be different based on where these shapes are. And you can test this right now if you close one eye and kind of hold your hand out in front of you, then close the other eye and switch back and forth. It should look like your hand is moving relative to the background, or maybe the background is moving relative to your hand. The way that your brain interprets isn't exactly precisely one way or the other, but you'll see some motion relative to them. And that's because your eyes aren't in the same spot, so the light that comes to them is going to travel on a slightly different path. As you can see here, the left eye doesn't see much of the triangle. The right eye sees pretty much the whole triangle. Then our brain, just because they're amazing, biological machines, I guess, through years and years of development, your brain ends up being able to interpret, well, if these two images are different in this way, that means that those objects are pretty close. Or if they're different in this way, that means they're pretty far. And this basically relies on the more similar the picture that your eyes are getting, your brain determines it's farther away. Something that's right in front of one eye is going to look very different when you open and shut the eyes than something that's, hundreds of miles away, where the images are that rays are essentially parallel. So with virtual reality, we basically, when we think about kind of traditional VR, there's a screen in front of each eye. It sends you a slightly different picture to give your brain the kind of sense of depth. And the way it actually works pretty easily is they just mathematically place two cameras in the virtual world that are eye distance apart, and it says, what do these two cameras see, quote unquote, when they look at the world? And that can all be done through a lot of math if that's something you're interested in. It's definitely a project idea of like figuring out the math of how a virtual camera determines what it sees. But if you're less interested, just know that it's a bunch of geometry and trigonometry and things called projections. All right, for augmented reality, this is kind of the other sort of subcategory that we look at sometimes. And this is all about overlaying digital labels and images on the real world. So you're looking, we would say, primarily at the real world, and then whatever device you're using is adding stuff on top of that, usually for a specific purpose, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So this is usually viewed with a pair of glasses. So you can imagine you can see through the glass or through a phone / camera. So if you've played Pokemon Go or any other AR game where you can like look through the camera and see stuff like as if it was part of the picture that you're taking, that's an example of augmented reality. They're overlaying some image or some model of something into the picture of the real world. And so that's what we've got with AR. And this one's really interesting. It's sometimes thought of as less flashy than virtual reality because you can't, you're not creating these fantastic worlds or whatnot. But the applications are really neat and interesting because it's all about giving yourself typically something useful or entertaining and like putting that into the real world. So if you've got a phone with the Google Translate app, I think all versions of the app have this. They've got like a real-time camera translation where you can, I know for sure it's on Android, you may have to take the picture for iOS, but you can basically look through your camera at some text and the computer inside the phone will recognize what the text is, recognize what language it's in, translate that text, and then instead of showing just the original text on the camera screen, it will overlay or like put on top of it kind of a text box with the translated text. So you can imagine, if you're looking at a street, a sign and you don't know what it says, you can hold up your phone and it will show you that in real time. Or if you're looking at a menu, you can do that. At one of the uses that people talk or kind of are looking at right now is doing AR navigation. So not only can you like look at a map on your phone and see where you need to turn, you could actually hold your phone up and then it would show what you see and it would like put if you'd have like a little dotted line that would like kind of go into an alley if that's where you need to turn, along with labels and angles. So you can see like, oh, it's this one specifically, or it's the next one or something like that. So there's lots of interesting use cases. Part of what you'll do in the rest of this lesson is do some research, pick out some of your own. But that's kind of the overview and kind of the two main subcategories when we're looking at extended reality or mixing real world stuff with virtual world stuff.